Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. It's me, Miss Farr from Cambridge High School and Milton, Georgia, by way of Atlanta. So today we're going to go ahead and finish up with period 5. So we're going to kind of talk about Reconstruction, the impact of Reconstruction as it pertains to African Americans, the South, women, and then we're going to kind of talk about the big picture. I will be providing everyone with a copy of the ABCs of period 5 once I'm done with today's lesson. So be on the lookout for that if you're on Twitter. And if you have not followed us on Twitter yet, please try to go ahead and do so that you can get all of our notes and powerful information at virtualapush.com. I'm sorry, at virtualapush. And Mr. Horton, my partner in crime, is monitoring the Twitter accounts. So if you have any questions as it pertains to testing or anything that I'm talking about, be sure to send him those questions and he'll be answering them. And then as we're going through the lesson today, of course, I'll be asking some questions for all of our students there. So yesterday you learned about the Civil War. You learned about the various battles. You learned about the impact and the reasons behind it, because we talked about the events the day prior to, kind of leading up to the Civil War, and what was the whole premise behind it. So now that the war is over, what is going to happen to our country at this point? Right now, it's still kind of that division there. So we have to kind of come up with a plan in order to fix the nation that is broken. So yesterday, Mr. Horton gave you a warm up, and this political cartoon is known as the first vote. So let's talk about, or I want you to, if you had a DBQ, for example, that was talking about the impact of Reconstruction on the United States. This actually was a question on a exam. I want to say it was about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I think it was a short essay question. A short answer question. And so let's talk about the historical significance of this. So, first thing you'll notice is that number one, they are all Black men. You'll notice that, one looks kind of like he was a farmer. The one behind him is a little bit more well dressed, with the hat on. One behind him kind of has a depiction of a Union soldier, and then another one in the background. You'll notice that the reason why they call this the first vote is because up until this point, Blacks in the United States were considered to be slaves or property. And even if you were free, you were not even considered to be a human being or even just a part of the nation. Now that you've had the 13th Amendment, which pretty much abolished slavery, the next thing to kind of take into consideration that the Republicans who were over behind the whole 13th Amendment was what's next? How do we turn the tide into our favor so that we can push our plan forth? And so you're going to get the passing of the 14th Amendment, which basically says now former slaves are now considered to be citizens of the United States. And then you're going to have the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men, not women, Black men the right to vote. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are basically going to be known as like your Civil War amendments or your Reconstruction amendments. I will basically just call them the Reconstruction amendments. And so the significance of this is it's just basically kind of depicting the overall plan of the radical Republicans. We'll talk about that name and how they kind of came about with that, kind of getting the first votes out. So you'll notice that back then, and this is not how we vote today, but basically the men are lining up to exercise the right that they now have gained. And so really, if you were going to explain this inside of a DBQ, you basically want to kind of talk about the end of the Civil War, the plans that Lincoln had, and how he and he wanted to figure out how basically he abolished slavery, and he was working towards getting them citizenship. But of course, he was assassinated prior to that point. But now you're kind of talking about the radical Republicans' plan for Reconstruction and getting that Black vote. And so we're going to kind of talk about that more as we dive into it. All right, so this is our lesson overview, kind of talking about the big picture, kind of talking about Reconstruction and what that meant, looking at the effects of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. We're going to look at some continuities, things that remain the same, and some things that changed in various regions, as also as national, overall national government. And then we're going to kind of talk about the significance and the impact of the Civil War on American values. And I wouldn't really call them new skills because we've been talking about these skills for the longest, but claims and evidences and sources, kind of things that you pull out from political cartoons, or if you're reading a passage. And then, of course, we're going to kind of talk about main ideas of two different sources. We're going to look at some political cartoons, kind of comparing them. And then, of course, historical reasonings to explain relationships among pieces of historical evidence. So let's go ahead and jump right into it and kind of talk about Reconstruction. All right, so the term Reconstruction basically is a process of readmitting former Confederate states to the Union, which lasted from 1865 to 1877. Um, this was something that was kind of already in process by Lincoln. During the Civil War, especially after he had written the Emancipation Proclamation, the idea is what's going to happen when this war is over with and the Union wins? How are we going to bring these states back into the fold? Are we going to remain divided, or are we going to become one nation? And Lincoln's plan had always been to create this one powerful nation, because a nation divided is basically divided is against itself. And he actually said this in one of his speeches, cannot stand. In other words, he feared that if we remain divided, as we were during the Civil War, then that could cause other countries or other nations to want to come in and try to conquer us. And we may kind of revert back to the way things were prior to the American Revolution. So that was something that he just didn't want to be that president who was known for breaking up what the founding fathers had already worked so hard and fought so hard to bring into fruition. And as far as the Southern states, what did Reconstruction mean for them? A lot of Southerners who were once wealthy prior to the Civil War, found themselves basically bankrupt. They found their economy, their way of life had completely changed because slavery was illegal. Many slaves had abandoned their plantations and kind of went off on their own, not really knowing what's going to happen or how people were going to respond to that. So you're seeing a lot of drastic changes. In the South, you saw cities and towns and farms that were ruined, especially if those were on the path when Sherman did his march to the sea. You also saw high food prices, crop failures, and a lot of Southerners had faced starvation, because you had to think about it. Many of them did not know basic things with farming because, of course, some of them may have been a part of the plantation system or had worked for somebody who owned a plantation. And so therefore they didn't do all the work that it took in order to, be able to keep crops going. And then, of course, the biggest thing was Confederate money was pretty much worthless. Anybody who was still in possession of that, found themselves basically, like I said, bankrupt. The banks had failed, and the merchants pretty much who were there really pretty much became bankrupt. Those who funded the Civil War, especially from the Confederate side, found out that, they couldn't get their debts, they couldn't get their money back, people who owed debts. And so it was pretty much just like the beginnings of like a recession for the Southern states. And the Northern states, while a lot of people assume they were wealthy, some of them were okay, but it wasn't as if the nation was just better off. There was still a lot of big divide that was happening there. And so now we got to figure out how to fix the nation. All right, so Lincoln right now is still alive, so we're getting there, just in case you're wondering. He came up with something called the 10% plan. And again, remember I told you he kind of came up with this after the Emancipation was written. He had already worked on actually had worked on and was successful in getting the 13th Amendment passed prior to his assassination. And so what this 10% plan called for was like a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction. Amnesty is basically where somebody does something, and so you basically it's kind of like a forgiveness. However, it's not going to come without stipulations. When he granted amnesty, he was basically going to kind of talk about what is called a loyal rule. And so what that meant was when he says 10%, he basically just says, number one, you have to recognize the 13th Amendment. And he had already began working with Congress and various Republicans on the 14th Amendment for getting citizenship. He basically said, I will pardon all of your soldiers with the exception of the high ranking officials, because they were the ones who put out, the orders and things like that. And of course, if 10% of your voting population basically takes an oath of loyalty coming back into the Union, and you guys recognize these amendments that we put into place, then the biggest thing will happen is that I will allow you, I will forgive you, and you will be a part of the government. If you were a senator, a former senator, you will be welcome back into the Senate or back into the House of Representatives. So all of these things he was kind of coming about. a lot of people thought he was a little bit too lenient with this. A lot of the radical Republicans thought that he should have had harsher, stiffer laws. But Lincoln's idea was that I don't want to punish anybody. I'm trying to bring the Union back together. And so I feel like if I'm revengeful about it, it's going to force the Southern states, to really kind of pull back. And that's not what's going to happen. He really, 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 truly wanted to bring people into the forefold. And so he came up with what he called Lincoln governments. And this was in 1864. He targeted specific states that he felt, if I could get these places here, if I can pull these places back into the Union, then I know for a fact that the others will follow. And so he targeted Louisiana, he targeted Tennessee, and he targeted Arkansas. And so by doing that, what he felt like, they were weak. They really, really needed the Northern Army, because they were, they had a lot of Northern armies. He had put people there in places to kind of see and report back to him. And so basically what he said is that he wanted to make sure that, if he can get these states and basically prove that he is not trying to be vengeful, he's not trying to change the way of life, he's trying to help those governments, then of course, like the South Carolinas and the Georgias and, the Alabamas and the Mississippis will soon follow along, and all will be well. Unfortunately, he did not come to see that to fruition. In April 14th of 1965, Lincoln and his wife were at Ford's Theater, and John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southerner, who was still kind of bitter and angry and really an advocate for this the Southern cause. He opposed all of Lincoln's policies, and so basically he assassinated him. Now, there was a huge conspiracy theory behind that about the events that took place because of the layout of the theater, how, certain ways that he was able to escape, how the doors just happened to be open that particular night, the alley that he ran in back of Forest Theater, how he was able to make his escape. And so there's always been these theories behind that it was more than just him. There were other people who were aiding him in his plight. So while this was happening, Lincoln died the next morning. And so the question we have already kind of put into place is usually when the president dies in office, or this is the first time that a president had been assassinated, same rule still applies, where the vice president will now be sworn in. And so Reconstruction is now going to be in the hands of Andrew Johnson. And he was a little bit more, very much so different than the person who preceded him in that office. One of the things that Johnson kind of talked about was that he was just a little bit more, I guess I wouldn't call it spiteful, but I guess would say he was a little bit more harsh with his terms as far as allowing those states to kind of come back into the Union. So we're going to watch a little video that kind of talks about Reconstruction and the era and just what the intent was. And then we'll go into more details about what Reconstruction actually did for our nation.
What had been pulled down was a way of life, built on the bondage and exploitation of others. But following Union victory, during what is known as the Reconstruction era, 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution extended to former slaves the blessings of liberty: freedom, citizenship, the right to due process and equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens feared that laws alone would be inadequate.
The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. If we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better have left them in bondage.
The concern was prescient. For die-hard Confederates, Reconstruction and racial integration were bitter pills. Through intimidation and terror, they sought to redeem what had been lost on the battlefield. Seething resentment toward Northern invaders fueled the growth of vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan or KKK. Clad in white robes and bearing torches, Klan posses terrorized the South. One former slave recalled a Klan lynching.
I never will forget when they hung Cy Guy. They comed after him 100 strong. They ties him there in the woods, and with that blood they writes that he shall hang between the heavens and the earth till he is dead, dead, dead. Well, sir, the next morning there he hung, swinging in the wind.
Okay, so here's a quick question for the Twitter universe and see who can come up with the first answer, and I'll give you a hint. The video actually mentioned the start of the KKK, the vigilante group. Did anybody guess who was one of the founders of the KKK that happened in the southern states? And here's the hint. Think of the movie Forrest Gump, and we'll see who can come up with that first. All right, so Andrew Johnson takes office. He is the 16th president of the United States. He was pro-slavery. So I told you he was very much so different than Lincoln, which, you know, being pro-slavery basically just meant that he actually, you know, believed that, you know, people should have the right to own slaves. He was a senator, and he was also the military governor of Tennessee. So he was actually in one of the, you know, those states that, you know, pretty much was kind of like, some had people for, some people against, and Andrew Johnson was for. One of the things that Johnson kind of had to think about when Lincoln's assassination, because his point of view kind of differed a lot, as far as with Reconstruction allowing those states to come back than Lincoln's did. So here's the first question he had to kind of think about it. And a lot of people kind of wondered, like, was he going to do the same things that Lincoln did? Would he follow Lincoln's moderate approach to reconciliation? Would he be as forgiving? Is the 10% plan worth it? You know, was that something that he was willing to do? The second thing was, would he support limited Black suffrage as Lincoln did? One of the things that the radical Republicans kind of came up with is that you know, if we basically ended slavery and we abolished slavery and now we grant them citizenship, what next? What can we give them in order to sway them to our side and give them support to the Republican platform? And so they were wondering, like, would he actually support an amendment where it's going to give Blacks the right to vote? Then, of course, the last thing is, would he follow the radical Republicans and be harsh and punitive towards the South? You know, a guy who's from the South who is pro-slavery may not be or react the same way. And so it's really, really going to kind of be a, you know, kind of a flip of the coin as to which side Andrew Johnson is going to come on. I just got word that Anthony Prescott got the answer correct. The first general, or the first one of the founders of the KKK, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate soldier. And we'll talk about more as we kind of get along into it. Johnson, of course, vetoed several bills because other things that radical Republicans were trying to figure out is, you know, we want to kind of grant them certain rights. And we know that even if we give them these amendments, the southern states do not have that option of following those laws. And so he basically, any type of bills that were giving civil rights to Black males, he basically vetoed them. However, he was overridden by the Senate. So the radical Republicans were going to figure this out one way or another. And one of the things they realized is that by giving or granting them civil rights and granting the right to vote, that meant more support for the Republican platform, because they're more likely to vote for those who actually voted for them, or basically put laws into place that will help the Black population. This was basically the first time in our history where we do have a major piece of legislation that was overridden by the presidential veto. So that whole systems of checks and balances really kind of came into the foreplay here. And it was very fortunate that it was there, because the radical Republicans did have a lot of momentum at this time. Radical Republicans then were able to pass the 14th Amendment. So now, there you go. Blacks now have citizens. So they're now going to be called by people in the Union or in the Senate, African Americans versus just Blacks or former slaves. Of course, down South, they're not going to be called that at all. They're also going to pass several acts. One of them is going to be the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which puts into place laws for them to, in order to build schools for African Americans, in order to help get jobs, in order to put things into place to help them get housing, lodging, and all those different things. So the Reconstruction Act, another thing that it did was to ensure that as these states were actually allowed back into the Union after they pledged their loyalty oath, that they weren't going to deny African Americans their rights that they now have gained. And so Congress is going to basically divide the South into these 5 districts, or they refer to them as districts, but the Southern states refer to them as military districts. They basically were under military control. They had, soldiers there who patrolled. They would pretty much kind of look, watch, report back, and make sure that things were, going as planned as far as the government was concerned, as they're getting ready to allow the Southern states to come back into the Union. Uh, One of the things that was required under the Reconstruction Act of 1867 was that new state constitutions, very much so, especially in the Southern states, had to be rewritten. They basically had to include the right, the 13th and the 14th Amendment, which basically they had to recognize and agree to uphold no slavery. They also had to realize that African Americans are now going to be African Americans. And also, the last one is the 15th Amendment, which is not going to come into be enacted until 1870, which will give Black men the right to vote. Now, keep in mind, abolitionists are extremely happy with the results of this. The fact that slavery is now over, the fact that they now have voting rights, and the fact that they now have citizenship. But there is one group of people who have been fighting for the right to vote for so long, and they're not actually even going to see this until 1920. So for those of you who are trying to figure out, I'm talking about women. The women who supported the abolitionist movement and who really were supporting the end of slavery actually thought that they were going to get some support from those Black men to be included in this amendment where they were going to give Black men the right to vote, because they figured, okay, well, there are Black women and they're African American as well, so they're going to be included into this as well. And it did not happen. So you're going to start to see the women's suffrage movement really kind of take a hit here, but it's actually going to kind of cause them to kind of sit back and kind of rethink some things as far as their approach. So now that we have these amendments, that does not mean that the Southern states are extremely happy about this. So now what they're trying to figure out is, just because they're no longer slaves and just because they're not considered citizens, what can we do to make sure that they understand their place in our society? Because how is it that and this was the mind frame of many of them, how is it that former slaves can now be on equal footing as I am when they weren't for so many years? So now they're going to put into place a series of laws to kind of circumvent that. So it's basically a legal way of getting around those amendments in order to kind of prove that they still have that power. So these are going to be known as the Black Code. So we're going to watch this quick video clip.
Mr. Senator Ross, how say you? Not guilty.
In May of 1868, Andrew Johnson was impeached and came within one vote in the Senate of...
Okay, sorry about that. Actually, we're going to talk about something else before we kind of talk about the Black Code. So this is actually looking up at the events leading up into Andrew Johnson and his impeachment. And after they put all these laws into place, they also put several other acts into place. And one of them was called the Tenure of Office Act. And Andrew Johnson, these are going to be one of the charges. This is basically the act that he violated, which actually caused him to start these impeachment processes. So he's actually going to be the first president in our history who actually is going to be impeached. And we'll talk about his trial. Sorry about that. So we're going to talk about his impeachment first, and then we're going to talk about the ways that the Southern states tried to circumvent what was going on with the radical Republicans.
Being removed from office. The country was spared the injury of removing Johnson from office. Yet in the end, the president had lost the confidence of his countrymen. Later that year, the popular general, Ulysses S. Grant, was chosen to be the 18th president of the United States.
Finally, in 1870, Congress ratified the 15th Amendment.
It prohibited denial of the right to vote because of race or previous servitude. Beverly Nash, a former slave, expressed well the views of many uneducated Americans who recognized their new constitutional right to vote.
I believe, my friends and fellow citizens, that we are not prepared for the suffrage, but in time, we can learn. Give a man tools and let him commence to use them, and in time, he shall learn a trade. So it is with voting. We may not understand it at the start, but in time, we shall learn to do our duty.
Okay, so let's talk about what this meant. So Andrew Johnson kind of sort of put into place some of the things that Lincoln had said. Although, like I said, some of the things he did not believe in, so he did veto them and then they were overridden. But one of the biggest things with the Reconstruction Act was the fact that he did not agree. He did not like that act. And so instead of, because he knew that he was overridden by Senate, he decided to get rid of the person who was in charge of enforcing it, which was Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War. And so one of the things that he was in violation was the Tenure of Office Act. And so because of that, the House came up with 9 articles of impeachment that was related to how he did the violation. And so if you understand the process of impeachment, the charges are brought up in the House of Representatives. So basically, they come up with the articles. They kind of tell you what the president has violated. And then, of course, they can vote as to whether or not these articles to go ahead and proceed and to begin the proceedings and basically say that the person is impeached. Now, impeached does not mean that you're no longer president. Impeachment just means charges has been brought up. These are what the articles that they have found that you have violated. Now what happens is these articles are going to be drafted. The document is going to be sent to the Senate, and then the Senate will then hold a trial and determine if the articles were actually violated and decide on if the president can or cannot be removed from office. It does require a 2/3 vote from the Senate. And so Johnson, of course, was basically charged. He did have a trial, and it was a very, very, very close vote. And pretty much what they said was that if you look at the vote, 35-19, so it was pretty close. However, he was not removed. So yes, he was impeached. He is our first president to actually be impeached. And of course, there are 3 presidents. So he will be one of the 3 that has been impeached. So for Twitterverse, who are the other 2 individuals or presidents that have been impeached in our history? And so because of this, he basically just said his defense was that it was a clear violation of a law. There was only basically it was very simple that, it was only a clear violation of the law that warranted his removal. And so they kind of used that as his defense. And he was basically kind of cleared of those charges. But he was already disgraced, which kind of led the way for Ulysses S. Grant, who was a former general during the Civil War, very well liked, to kind of take over. Reconstruction did not go very well underneath Grant. And the reason is because he had his focus was more so on other things versus what was really the plan for Reconstruction. He had a series of different scandals that were happening within his office. And basically he trusted the wrong people that he put into to various offices that kind of caused him to his focus to be kind of put elsewhere. So with slavery being abolished and radical Republicans really kind of looking at what to do now. Remember, a lot of slaves, they were not educated. They couldn't read, they couldn't write. Many of them didn't know certain traits, had certain skills. Many of them just kind of farmers. Some of them were tradesmen, they had a craft, but that was going to be hard as well. So they had to kind of figure out some government assistance programs. And so this was another thing that the radical Republicans and Johnson were kind of battling over as far as what type of assistance to offer. And so this was why it was very important for the radical Republicans to really get that 15th Amendment passed, because they wanted to say, hey, not only did we vote for you guys to no longer be slaves and gave you citizenship, but we also put into place some programs to kind of help you get acclimated and become citizens so that you can now exercise your right to vote. So one of the biggest things they came up with was the Freedmen's Bureau. They were created to address the needs of African Americans. They wanted to build the schools to successfully educate former slaves. There was this so-called promise of the 40 acres and a mule to give to former slaves. And of course, a lot of that was kind of hearsay. The Freedmen's Bureau also encouraged a lot of free Blacks to kind of go and move out west and kind of get new starts in other different areas. They wanted to try to redistribute Southern lands. But unfortunately, what's going to end up happening is that while slavery itself, the forced bondage is going to end, it's going to start a new system of slavery. And I will talk to you guys more about sharecropping and and all that stuff on Monday when we start talking about the New South and industry and technology and things like that. But just know that it did not actually end slavery. It just kind of introduced a new system of slavery where, yes, there was payment, but of course the payment was low. And congratulations to Liliana Arias, who actually got the answer correct about who were the other two presidents who were impeached in our history. So thanks, Liliana. All right. So I talked to you guys about the Southern states, and I talked to you guys about how they had to rewrite their constitutions, and they were not very happy about that. So they did come up with a lot of change or resistance to change. And the video kind of talked to you about, vigilante groups that were formed to terrorize African Americans who also supported, who basically, and anybody who supported racial equality, the KKK. But other ways they did that was something called the Black Codes. And the Black Codes basically were a legalized way of doing segregation. So a lot of the laws that they came up with Black Codes would not actually have been able to happen in the previous antebellum South. The fact that they wanted to have separate locations where Blacks could be in versus whites. The fact that they wanted to kind of do a lot of these restrictions with the voting. They had to come up with, things like they came up with like the grandfather clause, which is if your grandfather was a slave and couldn't vote, you couldn't vote. Things like that. So yeah, they could say, and they could write it down and say, we recognize and we understand the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But these codes are basically going to kind of limit how far those voting rights or how far those amendments will go. And so what ends up happening is that as this trial is happening with Andrew Johnson and the radical Republicans are starting to find themselves becoming unraveled, they're eventually going to be replaced with individuals who are going to be known as the Redeemers. And the Redeemers are just like that. They wanted to redeem the old ways of the South and all of its glory. They were very much so, pro-slavery groups. And so basically, they're going to put into place Democratic politicians and replace it with the ideas of something called white supremacy, or the superiority thing of, those people who own slaves to kind of put them back. So basically kind of creating like a system of hierarchy where, those who were once in charge were at the top, and those who were former slaves are still going to find themselves there. Even though they have rights, they're going to kind of still find themselves at the bottom. And so the question you have to ask is, was Reconstruction as beneficial to African Americans as they tried to make it seem? So this is probably one of the one of the most famous cartoons that really kind of depicted people's thoughts and how they were thinking with Reconstruction. Thomas Nast, and this cartoon is called Worse Than Slavery. So I want you to take a few minutes and really kind of look at it. Remember what I told you guys, pay attention to the details that are inside of your political cartoon. So take a few minutes. Okay, so if you were to discuss the point of view, what was Thomas Nash trying to say with this political cartoon? Well, first of all, you'll notice that you have two groups. You have the KKK here, and then you have a member of the White Citizens League. How do I know that? Because I'm looking at this little pamphlet that's in its pocket. One thing I also want you to notice is that he very much so was talking about the anonymity of these groups, because while they did operate, they could have been everyday ordinary citizens, but they always kind of covered their identity. So you have the member of the White League who's kind of has his face to the back, and then of course the member of the KKK who's facing forward, but his face is cloaked. Here, you'll see right here where it says the Union as it was. The fact that, the eagle is pretty much kind of almost burst into flames underneath here. You'll see where it says this is a white man's government. So really those ideas of white supremacy is kind of being depicted here. The lost cause. Here you'll notice the skull and the crossbones kind of representing death. So, here he's kind of talking about, was Reconstruction really good? What good did it do when it actually caused some groups to come up that were going to consider themselves vigilante groups that were doing nothing but terrorizing certain groups? If you look here, These are former slaves. They're kind of bending over in fright here as a result of this. Some things you'll notice in the shield, schoolhouses. So there's your depiction of the Freedmen's Bureau and the goals and the programs that they put into place. You know, the school being burned. Over here in the tree, someone is lynched here. You can tell that they were trying to be educated because there's a book here. So there's a question is, was Reconstruction good or bad? Was it, what good did it do if this was going to end up being the result of it? And he's not saying that he was against Reconstruction, but basically what he's saying is that the government could have done better. There could have been more harsher laws that they could have put into place, or they could have had better measures in order to offer more protection as opposed to allowing these things to happen. And so I want to kind of talk to you guys a little bit about what the Black Codes were. And I don't want you to get to Black Codes confused with Jim Crow. Black Codes came out first. Jim Crow will eventually will kind of be a derivative of the Black Code. So they're going to take everything that the Black Code said and kind of take it, a little bit one step further. So the purpose of the Black Codes basically was to guarantee a stable labor supply now that Blacks were emancipated. Remember, emancipated just means you're free. So it didn't mean that they did not want to see, former slaves not working. They wanted to have a guarantee of a stable labor supply. They wanted to restore pre-emancipation system of race relations. In other words, they still needed to have that separation where former slaves can, you are free now, you're no longer a slave, but you kind of still need to understand your place in this society. And this is what is going to end up happening. It is going to force a lot of Blacks to become sharecroppers, or what are called tenant farmers. And if you look at this picture here, kind of depicting, this is, a old version of slavery, but a lot of people said it's still it was sharecropping, even though Blacks are basically renting space, they're renting tools, and they're working the land, and they're making money, they still have to pay back. So it's kind of like they created a debt system in order to put people back, and basically they're going to end up finding themselves in a series of debt, and they cannot find themselves out of it as a result of this, because a lot of former slaves knew only one way of life, which was farming. So they kind of went into it, but the idea was that they were trying to get better lives. Now, did all free Blacks stay in the southern states? No. Many of them went up north. Some of them found themselves also facing discrimination. Some maybe not as harsh as it was in the South, but this discrimination is still going to be there. So now that we're at the end of Reconstruction, the idea is what needs to happen next, because Reconstruction ended with a presidential election. So while you're watching this video, here's another question. Whose president's, which president's election represented the end of Reconstruction? And I'm hoping that you guys will be able to answer that before the video actually reveals the answer. So which president's election is basically going to be the result of the end of Reconstruction? Let's see who can get that first before the video reveals.
Not to let their home state be ruled by freedmen, scalawags, and carpetbaggers, many secret societies evolved to stop this progress of Reconstruction. Based on the concept of white supremacy, thousands of respectable and not so respectable white citizens disguised themselves and rode at night to beat, whip, or lynch the blacks and whites promoting Reconstruction. Defending themselves as peacekeepers, horrible violent crimes were committed by these groups known as Knights of the White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, or the Ku Klux Klan. In spite of the racism prevailing in the South, many blacks accepted the challenges of citizenship and endeavored to make a living. Many tried to find land offered by the Homestead Act.
40 acres and a mule were promised to us, but rarely delivered. Some properties in the South were given to us freedmen, but most of the land available was poor and no good.
Eventually, some blacks sought the open frontier in the West, finding free land available to homesteaders. As the years of Reconstruction passed, the South became more determined to take control and to end Reconstruction. Blacks were intimidated to not vote. Federal troops grew weary to protect civil rights, and many Northerners lost interest in reforming their Southern neighbors. During the 1876 presidential election between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden, a dispute occurred questioning who had won. To settle the question, Southern Democrats agreed to let the Republican Hayes be president under the condition that all federal troops be removed from the South. This 1877 bargain brought an end to Reconstruction and the freedoms of blacks.
Okay, so I don't know if anybody had guessed Rutherford B. Hayes, but that would be the answer. His election basically resulted the end of Reconstruction. So let's kind of talk about the election of 1876. The election kind of pretty much almost they had a lot of similarities with what happened with Andrew Jackson's first presidential run. And the fact that, again, there was the issue of the fact that, who actually got the majority of the popular vote, even though they had the Electoral College. And so a deal was struck. And the idea was that the Democrats would support Rutherford B. Hayes if he would basically pull those federal troops out of the southern states. And so basically, it's not going to be known as the Compromise of 1877. And with his election, pretty much basically was the end of Reconstruction. And so what did that mean? It meant that a lot of African Americans who found themselves in certain offices are now going to find themselves without any support or any federal backing. I apologize. I just got word that Megan Gopalan, if I mispronounce your name, I apologize. She actually did get that answer correct for Rutherford B. Hayes. So, hey, and I'm glad that a lot of you guys were able to guess Hayes before the video actually revealed that. So that means your teachers are doing wonderful work. And of course, this was huge in the fact that you had this situation where Democrats would actually support someone who was not a part of their political party, but they also knew that they really weren't, I guess, they didn't really feel like Tilden would do that much of a good job. He wouldn't possibly, support their platform. And so they kind of said that there was an impartial electoral commission, but it really wasn't. A deal had to be struck, and Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the winner. And of course, that was contingent upon that compromise of 1877. With that, Reconstruction ends, and so now we're looking at what's going to happen. What is going to happen to all that work that the radical Republicans are going to do? Is there a possibility that they could take those amendments and amend them again and basically declare all this illegal? What is going to happen to the nation at this point? Is it really going to become the United States that Lincoln had hoped would come back together? A lot of people were really kind of unsure and unclear. But what they did know was that now life for anybody who was living in the South that was a former slave is pretty much not going to be the same anymore. So let's look at the big picture of everything with period 5 and just really kind of talk about the impact of the Civil War and also with Reconstruction. Before the war, United States was very rural. You did have some parts that were, industrialized, and that was the northern states. But especially when you're kind of going out west and also it's looking down south, it was a lot of rural, but it was a collection of, barely unified collection of states. And a lot of people weren't really looking at the United States. Like they weren't kind of looking at the United States, is it as a whole country. They were just kind of looking at it as, this is still kind of an experiment of what happened after the American Revolution. And a lot of people were wondering, is the United States going to be successful or are they going to fail? After the Civil War, you had a lot of countries that were wondering, were we going to be able to kind of come back together as one united nation, or is it going to kind of divide us apart? What about the federal government, because it was now kind of weakened a little bit? Are they going to be able to take the United States as a world power? And of course, it's kind of setting the stage for what will be America kind of beginning to make its marks as a world power. And then, of course, for a lot of historians, they do kind of depict that the Civil War is going to be a turning point. Which is why when you look at a lot of courses now in college, they kind of do history prior to 1865 and then they go to history after 1865, because there's a lot of trends and things that you see. And when you look at the continuity, remember we were discussing continuities, the changes definitely is the fact that now you have African Americans, free blacks, and no slavery. But one major continuity that I mentioned, I don't know if you guys caught that, women still don't have the right to vote yet. And the women's movement and suffrage movement is still continuing to happen. So that's still one of the things that's continuously, that's still going to remain the same for right now. So let's talk about that. What about the impact on African Americans and women? Of course, the biggest change, the 15th Amendment in 1870. It gave men the right to vote. So yeah, change as far as giving Black men the right to vote, but again, continuity, women weren't still allowed to vote. It was a huge disappointment for the suffrage movement. And of course, when the end of Reconstruction happened, what's now going to end up happening is that the southern states are going to take the Black codes and revamp them and make them into Jim Crow laws. And they're going to basically take all of the things, all the liberties and civil liberties that have been earned as a result of that are now going to be stripped down, basically making it impossible for those Blacks who were voting for Republican platforms to basically no longer be able to do that. Any political positions that they held prior to or during Reconstruction are now going to be taken away from them. Not many, not all of them, but a lot of places that had their first like Black mayors or their first Black judges, some of them are going to find those titles stripped from them. So let's do a little bit of exam practice here just to make sure. So I talked to you guys about the impact and how it was a huge blow to the women's suffrage movement. And so Susan B. Anthony, who is going to continue to take the plight that was left over from Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we're going to read this speech that she's going to talk about and really kind of answer this question, which is the excerpt above is best understood in the context. So now we're looking at context here. So take a few minutes. Okay, so the correct answer to this is going to be A, the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments. You should have automatically, after reading this, eliminated C and D. C was eliminated because of the fact that it's 1873, the Civil War had already ended. And D, to limit the political power of immigrants, that was not what, that she was pretty much talking about. And if you knew a little bit, you had the context of what I gave you about Susan B. Anthony, sorry. Knowing that she was a suffragist, that kind of would have gave you a little bit of hints in regards to this. And then, of course, she really wasn't talking about the efforts to change the Southern attitudes because by this point, the 13th and the 14th Amendments were already in place. And so now we're looking at really with the 14th Amendment, citizenship, and then especially the 15th Amendment, which is granting the voting rights. All right, what impact would the Civil War have on immigrants and natives? Well, again, white men and women and immigrants were all considered to be citizens of the United States because they still followed that protocol that was there. One of the things that was happening when I say natives, we also have to think about Native Americans. The US government began treating Native Americans as separate nations and also classifying them as wards of the state, not really looking at them as citizens still. So there's still that idea of should Native Americans get citizenship as well, so that they too can have those same civil liberties that were guaranteed inside of the Constitution. Remember I told you guys that you did have some immigrants that were coming in. I think Mr. Horton had talked to you guys about the Irish that were kind of coming in and settling on the East Coast. And I mentioned to you guys the other day about the West Coast and how you had Chinese immigrants who were coming in. They too were looking to get citizenship. And of course, you're going to find that there are going to be several laws that are going to be put into place. It's going to try to exclude them or prevent Chinese immigrants from kind of coming in. And then of course, too, what about Mexican Americans? We're still, looking at that border. We still have a lot of people who were a part of Mexico, which is, those new states of like California, Nevada, Utah, et cetera. They're going to see a lot of, while they're here, they're going to kind of see that there's going to be very limited change as far as their status too. And so if nothing else, when you're looking at the big picture, and don't forget, I'm going to tweet the ABCs for period 5 later. These are the 5 major things I want you to remember. Number 1, Americans enthusiastically supported westward expansion. So that whole idea of manifest destiny, we talked about the positives, we talked about the negatives. So just kind of remember the impact of that. The Compromise of 1850, Kansas, Nebraska, and Dred Scott were all attempts in order to resolve the issues around slavery. They were effective for a very small, limited a very limited amount of time, trying to prevent the Civil War. But of course, these things kind of led us onto the road to the Civil War. You also had debates about slavery, which led to economic, political, and cultural differences, which, again, widened the gap between the North and the South. The four kind of referencing the Civil War, kind of talking about even though the Southern states had fighting for their economic way of life, and the fact that the war was pretty much taught in their territory, which they were very much so familiar with that land. The fact that the North had more population, a stronger infrastructure, that's going to really kind of cause them to be able to have that Union defeat. And then, of course, the major things is after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, 14th and 15th were passed, which basically expanded rights into the African American community. So very quickly, because we're limited on time here, this is kind of referencing Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. It says, what do you find interesting about this image and what do you find puzzling about this image? So very quickly, kind of look at it. Okay, so what you see here is him trying to piece everything kind of back together, really kind of looking at it. If you look at some of the images here, this whole call stitching together, kind of bringing it up to kind of looking at those Lincoln states that I referenced. Remember, I was talking about Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee. Remember, that were those Lincoln states that he had kind of targeted, and really kind of bringing us back together. And then, of course, puzzling about this, it says, take it quietly, Uncle Abe, and I'll begin to draw it closer than ever. Really kind of talking about, who would he be talking to when he says a few more stitches, Andy, and the good old Union will be, will be mended. And so, of course, he's talking to his vice president and really kind of looking at it together. And remember, they both had a very, very much so opposing views. Andrew Johnson was a pro-slavery former, from the, former military person from the state of Tennessee. So he would not have had the same ideals as far as bringing it back together as Lincoln did. And then you'll kind of saw that with him basically voting against the Civil Rights Acts that they were trying to put into place after Lincoln's death. This right here, very quickly, we were talking about the comparison really quickly of two different sources. So it says, this is talking about the vote on the 11th article of impeachment. This is kind of referencing Johnson's impeachment. Here, you'll notice that there's a lot of familiarity here. This guy who's president dressed as the king. He has, not the bottle of alcohol, but that's kind of a whole depiction of, a reference to Andrew Jackson and how they refer to him as King Jackson. And it says here, elevation at the White House. Here, basically, he's kind of celebrating his victory. And then over here says depression at the Tribune office here. So the Tribune office would be like, this is what happened as a result. So he was victorious, even though everyone knew that he clearly had violated the Tenure of Office Act by trying to remove somebody who was basically doing their job. We won't have time for that. So I wanted to kind of really, so let's just do really very quickly for this. If we had to answer that question, it says the Civil War is seen as such an enormous turning point in U.S. history that most colleges split into the before and the after. But why was the United States really different in before and after the war? So if you were going to give a response to this question, basically this is just kind of a short way of saying it. The war brought some immediate short-term changes in the American ideals of democracy and citizenship, which would fade after the end of Reconstruction, while the belief of the divine mission of the United States to spread across North America only intensified in this time period. Even though there was little change in the 19th century, the seeds immediately after the Civil War would sprout major changes into the 20th century. And so basically now what you're seeing is what they're basically depicting is now that we've settled from ocean to ocean, what's next for the nation. So something to think about for Monday, and I will be back with you guys, and this is going to be our last week, kind of leading us into period 6, is explain the historical context for the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States. Now that we're in the United States, what does industrial capitalism look like? How is that going to look? And then, of course, what will that trend look like to other outside of the United States? So sorry for going over time, ladies and gentlemen, but a lot of stuff with Reconstruction. Couldn't touch it all, but I will give you some stuff to go by. So pay attention on Twitter in the next 5 minutes. Thank you guys for watching and have a great day.